I think for the Confederate forces, East and West, because this is a two-front war, there are several episodes early on where they had a legitimate chance to really drive a knife into the heart of the U.S. war effort. And I would say that in the West, that Shiloh's, that first day, that was their chance to totally alter the course of the war.
In the hellish terrain surrounding a simple log structure known as Shiloh Church, rages the first epic battle of the Civil War. In a dawn attack, nearly 44,000 Confederates, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston, surprised the Union Army. The Federal troops had boldly advanced into southwest Tennessee, with the hopes of winning a grand battle that they believe will end the war. A few hours into the Battle of Shiloh, those hopes are all but dashed. By midday, Union Generals Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman rally their stunned troops. The Confederate attack loses steam. For most, Shiloh is their first taste of battle. The casualties are unimaginable. Even Johnston, considered by many to be the best of the Confederate generals, lies dead.
Johnston, do you know me? Do you know me?
And now Shiloh becomes the first of the big slaughters of the Civil War. The loss of life, the wounds at Shiloh are on a scale that the United States had not previously encountered.
By mid-afternoon, the fight shifts from the Union flanks to a dense thicket in the center of the battlefield, at a place survivors would later dub the Hornet's Nest. 6,000 stubborn Union soldiers repulse attack after attack. After hours of failed piecemeal assaults, Confederate leaders begin shifting every available cannon on the Shiloh battlefield. The batteries now take aim at the Hornet's Nest, just 300 yards away. For more than an hour, Confederate guns pound away at the Hornet's Nest. The barrage pins down the Union forces. The brutal combat at Shiloh marks the first titanic battle of the Western Campaign. The Federal armies have invaded, intending to sever a crucial railroad junction just 20 miles south at Corinth, Mississippi. The railroad is the Confederacy's only complete line connecting the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic Ocean. In the East, the Union has already been humiliated at Bull Run, a battle just 20 miles from the White House. Another defeat, this time in lands then known as the West, will be a crushing blow to Abraham Lincoln's hope of reunifying a divided nation.
The Western theater, I argue, is the most significant part of the war. Had it not been for that activity in the Western theater, that war might have gone on forever and the number of casualties would have been greater. It's clear to me, in any way, that the Western theater is where the war was either won if you're a Union supporter or lost if you're a Confederate.
A Confederate victory at Shiloh would be a giant step toward the goal of Southern independence.
Steady, boys, steady.
While the battle rages in the Hornet's Nest, another fight is about to explode in the steep terrain overlooking the Tennessee River.
We can do it, boys.
There, a frightened John Cockerell stands among the ranks of the 9th Illinois.
Rebels are coming, but we're gonna hold our ground. You understand that? Ohio, you're gonna stick with us. We'll get you through this today. We will be victorious, boys. We'll get you back to your family and to your unit.
Earlier in the day, the 16-year-old from Ohio became separated from his father's regiment during the fierce clash near Shiloh Church. A lieutenant with the 9th Illinois convinced the young Ohioan to fight with them. Now, Cockerell and the others wait for an attack that is sure to come.
Everything looked weird and unnatural. The leaves on the trees, though scarcely out of the bud, seemed greener than I had ever seen leaves, and larger. With a suddenness, there came from all along our front a crash of musketry. Actions took the grotesque form of nightmares. The roar and din of the battle and all its terror outstripped my most fanciful dreams of pandemonium.
For nearly 3 hours, Confederates deliver what Cockerell calls a dreadful baptism of fire. Among those killed is Frederick E. Vogler, the chipper young lieutenant who invited young Cockerell to fight with his regiment.
The enemy fire became so terrible we were driven into the ravine. We kept firing as long as cartridges lasted. It was at this point our blue line wavered. Out of the ravine we survivors poured, pursued by the howling enemy. I remember my horror at the thought of being shot in the back as I retreated from the top of the bank and galloped as gracefully as I could.
Interestingly, the soldiers referred to first experience of combat as seeing the elephant. And when you think about what an elephant looks like and what an elephant might do to you, it gives you, I think, kind of a good insight into the way these people felt.
In this bloodbath, the 9th Illinois loses more men killed and wounded than any Union regiment at Shiloh. Cockerell somehow survives the slaughter. He joins a line of Union stragglers retreating back to the Tennessee River.
In the crowd of fear-stricken and dejected soldiers, I met a man who belonged to my father's regiment.
Have you seen my dad?
Inquiring of the fate of the regiment, he told me it had been entirely cut to pieces, and he had personally witnessed the death of my father, seen him shot from his horse. This filled me with dismay, and I determined, non-combatant that I was, to retire from the battlefield.
For Federals in the Hornet's Nest, the situation has grown desperate. In late afternoon, both flanks of the Confederate Army press forward, tightening the noose. The stubborn Union soldiers are surrounded. Some Federal troops manage to slip out of the trap, but for many, there is no escape.
Take him up the hill. Lead him up the hill.
General Benjamin Prentiss, who survived the opening Confederate assault some 10 hours earlier, finds himself surrounded in a wooded ravine. Prentiss surrenders, along with more than 2,200 Union soldiers. Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant hastily establishes a 2-mile-long last line of defense. The Confederates mount one final assault, but the Union line stands firm. After 13 hours of fighting, the exhausted Confederate troops pull back to the captured Union camps. With Albert Sidney Johnston dead, General P.G.T. Beauregard assumes command.
Take him to a team. Yes, sir.
At his headquarters near Shiloh Church, he dispatches a message to Confederate President Jefferson Davis describing a complete victory. 16-year-old Thomas Duncan is a Confederate courier.
With a seeming victory in our grasp, and with the brave, though depleted and disorganized Army of the Blue at bay at river's brink, we saw the battle cease for the day.
But U.S. Grant is not ready to concede defeat. He knows reinforcements are on the way. Not beaten by a damn sight, he mutters. Though bloodied, Grant's army had survived to fight another day.
And Grant was at the moment of crisis, and even the great commanders have moments of crisis. He always, I think, believed in himself in that capacity. I don't think a man like Grant ever had a doubt that he would win.
All of the high officers, with one exception, seemed to believe that they would pull out and that they would cross the river during the night and escape. The one exception to all this, of course, was Grant himself.
Night comes. And Sherman comes up to him and really to see, well, what's going to happen? What are we going to do the next day?
And Sherman says to him, well, Grant, we've had the devil's own time today, haven't we?
And Grant looks at Sherman and says, yep, we'll lick him tomorrow, though.
And Sherman is just taken back. This guy's not going to retreat. He's going to go on the offensive the next day. And this is an incredible thing to do.
I think that certain people are placed in certain places by luck or by fate. And Grant was in the right spot.
I cannot think of any general at this time in the history of the war who would have done the same thing.
Late that night, a violent storm engulfs the Shiloh battlefield. Thunder and lightning combine with cannon fire from Union gunboats to create a night no soldier at Shiloh will ever forget.
The woods, that first night especially, are filled with sounds that you could never accurately reproduce. There were soldiers who wrote on that first night of hearing the wild hogs feeding on the wounded. And having to listen to that all night. And there's no button you can push to shut it off. And then when the sun comes up, you know it's going to start all over again.
When the sun comes up that second day, Beauregard believes that he's won the great victory, and it's just a matter of mopping up. The Union Army was in terrible shape. They've been driven back. Their confidence is broken. They're finished.
Defeat is the last thing on Grant's mind. Overnight, 13,000 soldiers, commanded by General Don Carlos Buell, have finally arrived from Nashville. General Lew Wallace reinforces Grant with another 5,800 Union soldiers. According to a soldier from Louisiana, Federal troops sprouted from the ground like mushrooms. Courier Thomas Duncan.
A small squad of us were preparing breakfast when firing began suddenly on the line. A wild-eyed rider proclaimed the arrival of Buell, warning us to run for our lives.
It's apparent that counterattack has power to it. It has power, it has purpose, and it's mass, and it's totally unexpected.
April 7th is like day one at Shiloh, but in reverse. Beauregard's stunned Confederates rally, fighting desperately to halt the onslaught of the reinforced Federals.
It's no longer a sense of getting up and finding something to eat this morning. It's getting up and finding something to put in my musket so I can fight this battle, because this battle has come back, and it's come back into my face.
A continued breakdown in the Confederate chain of command only makes matters worse. Colonel John Moore commands a makeshift brigade of 3 regiments, which includes his own 2nd Texas Infantry. Moore is ordered to advance his brigade across a peach orchard, but to hold his fire. In the woods ahead of him, Moore is told, waits another Confederate force.
And it's apparent they don't know who's in front of them, but they've been told who's in front of them. And they've been told they're friends.
The soldiers located in front of Moore's approaching men are not friends. They are from Indiana and Ohio. John C. Moore.
Even after the enemy opened fire, my officers reported the order was still given not to fire on our supposed friends. In one instance, after a private returned the fire of the enemy, a staff officer drew his pistol and threatened to blow off the man's head if he fired again.
There's no way for anybody really to get a handle on it, except maybe in the decision that Moore makes after the ambush, when he's ordered to attack and he refuses.
The chaos Moore and his men face is experienced by many Confederates on Shiloh's second day. The fighting is every bit as fierce and bloody as the day before. Confederates under General Beauregard's leadership fight bravely. But now, outnumbered and overwhelmed, they are steadily driven back to Shiloh Church. An aide to General Beauregard sums up the situation by saying, "The fire and animation has left our troops." Shortly after 2 p.m., Beauregard issues an order unthinkable just 8 hours earlier. Withdraw.
They came so very close to be so close to victory so many times and never quite be able to achieve it. It was almost like it was something that they were reaching out for and they never could quite get it.
General Grant remains under orders to not engage the Confederates. For now, he is content to have recovered Union camps lost the previous day. The Confederates endure a bitter 20-mile march back to Corinth, Mississippi. There, they'll dig in to defend the town's vital rail junction. After after Shiloh, laments one New Orleans resident. The South never smiled again.
Shiloh illustrates that the war is here and it's deadly. They're going to have to invest everything into the war to win their cause. How could anyone smile with that vision of the future?
For the next few days, Union soldiers undertake the gruesome task of burying the dead. Even the hard-bitten General Sherman is moved.
The battlefield was a heart-sickening sight. The dead were lying in every conceivable shape. Some had fallen with their guns fast in their hands. Others had received the messenger of death, and with their lifeblood ebbing away, had sought the shelters of logs and trees, and laid down to die.
It's impossible, I think, for us to imagine what it must have looked like. The smell is awful. There are burial details every place. And maybe the biggest horror of all is as the Union Army is trying to reorganize itself and wagons are going back and forth across the battlefield, the wheels of the wagons will dig up shallow graves, and you will see corpses lying there being run over by wagons and by horses. And what a horrible thing. You have to think to yourself, is this what's going to happen to me?
At Shiloh, the total casualties, a staggering 24,000 men. A single battle claims more casualties than all of America's previous wars combined.
They did arithmetic. All of a sudden they could realize, hell, that's more people lost in 2 days than we've lost in all the wars we've fought to date. That becomes apparent to everyone. Golly, in 2 days, we've amassed, the same amount of killed, wounded, and missing personnel in our military bodies as we've accomplished in nearly a century of existence. That's shocking. You think about the connections of that 24,000. This begins to affect homes, it affects communities, it affects loved ones, friends. Entire communities end up having a bad day because a sizable preponderance of their young men, 18 to 29, are gone. They're no longer, or they're totally torn to pieces and maimed for life, and it just reverberates.
The great battle General Grant and others hoped would end the war is in fact just the beginning of a brutal war no one could have imagined. When the battle began, John Cockerell was a young musician. Now, in the aftermath of bloody Shiloh, the 16-year-old Cockerell is a combat veteran. Near dusk, he wanders through the ransacked camp of the 70th Ohio. The last place he saw his father alive. Through the haze is a sight Cockerell can hardly believe.
The 70th Regiment came back after the most terrible fighting and campaigning. At its head rode my father, whom I supposed to be dead. He was pale, haggard, and worn, but unscathed. My father had not seen me nor heard from me for more than 60 hours. He took me into his arms and gave me the most affectionate embrace my life had ever known.
7 months after Shiloh, John Cockerell returned to the Ohio home he dreamed of during the battle. He would become an accomplished journalist, writing for the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Washington Post. Years later, he would write about 2 days in April 1862, when the world appeared to turn upside down in the thick woods along the Tennessee River. Two weeks after their defeat at Shiloh, the Confederacy suffers another blow in the West. A fleet of Union warships under the command of Admiral David Farragut captures New Orleans, the South's largest city and most important port. And for Confederate troops over 1,000 miles away in Virginia, the war effort begins to falter. Union General George McClellan, nicknamed Little Napoleon, has a bold plan to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. In March 1862, McClellan landed more than 100,000 troops at Fort Monroe and begins to fight his way up the peninsula towards Richmond. At Seven Pines, Confederate commander Joseph Johnston is severely wounded and replaced with a rising star named Robert E. Lee. 4 months after it began, Lincoln orders McClellan to return his army to Washington. For the Union, the Peninsula Campaign is a military disappointment. Yet, it was a seemingly minor incident a year earlier, on the tip of the very same Virginia Peninsula, that ignites a sweeping chain of events that would alter the course of the war. May 1861, 3 runaway slaves row a stolen boat and surrender to the Union-occupied Fort Monroe. Their arrival creates a legal dilemma for the fort's commander and for the United States Army. President Abraham Lincoln refuses to recognize the Confederate government. He considers the Southern states to be in rebellion. Therefore, federal law still applies in the South. Legally, the escaped slaves are the property of their Southern owner and must be returned.
The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 is still on the books. It's still the law of the land. And strictly speaking, the United States Army is obligated to live up to the tenets of the Fugitive Slave Law. Those soldiers are, after all, obliged to enforce the law.
The next day, a Confederate officer, under a flag of truce, arrives at Fort Monroe and demands the property back. The Union fort's commander, General Benjamin Franklin Butler, quickly rejects the request. The runaways had earlier revealed that they were going to help construct Confederate gun emplacements, guns to be aimed directly at Fort Monroe. Butler curtly dismisses the Confederate officer, calling the escaped slaves contrabands of war.
Contraband means property, and so there's this legal term that enters the lexicon, and it is latched onto and used throughout the end of the Civil War.
And what Butler's thinking is that they are still property, but they are enemy property, and therefore it is lawful in a time of war for the Union to seize them. So he justifies allowing these slaves to stay in Union Army lines as contraband.
And within a few days, he had 200 fugitive slaves at the fort's door, and he took them all in, confiscating them as contraband of war. He realized by taking this source of labor, this source of aid, that it would cripple the Confederacy.
In Washington, D.C., President Lincoln and his cabinet follow the unfolding drama. He takes no formal action, for now.
It took the Union Army by surprise, and it took the Union government by surprise. It took Lincoln by surprise. They were not expecting this. They did not plan for it. They had not encouraged it. They had not put out a welcome mat for the enslaved to come into Union Army lines, but they came anyway.
Although Lincoln was not going to encourage people overtly to break the law, he certainly was not going to see slaves who did run away returned to their slavery, to their bonds, to their chattel status. To the contrary, he said, I'd be damned in time and eternity if I ever allowed that to happen. Slaves, he said to Congress, slaves who have achieved their actual freedom are not going to be molested in that. That was as much as waving a very large flag that said, come hither and find safety.
The news of the contrabands at Fort Monroe quickly spreads throughout the Union. The news also spreads among the enslaved themselves.
What powers the need for freedom for enslaved people is they don't want to be degraded anymore. They don't want to be brutalized anymore. They don't want to exist as property. So all of a sudden you have government officials, you have military officers who are confronted with the fact that we have to take Black concerns seriously.
At this point now, you have growing refugee camps within Union lines and in all of the border states. They don't wait for Lincoln to free them. They are agents in their own emancipation.
Lincoln hoped at the beginning of the war to keep the opposition to slavery and the restoration of the Union running on two separate but parallel tracks. One problem, the problem of the rebellion, he wanted to solve militarily. The other problem, the problem of slavery, he wanted to solve politically. What he found, though, a year into the war, was that these two tracks, as much as he was trying to keep them separate, insisted on converging.
The contraband issue triggers a fundamental question. Are the contraband still slaves? Or are they now free?
There is a dynamic, a collision of people on the ground, slaves running to Union armies not knowing how to handle this problem, but knowing that if they sent those slaves back, that they simply would be abetting the Confederate war effort. That step that slaves took toward Union lines, it triggers a process.
Congress passes a series of largely ineffective laws called the Confiscation Acts. It is legislation the president opposes. Lincoln's own views on abolishing slavery continue to evolve. Early in the war, he favors a plan to remove freed slaves to a colony outside of the United States. In summer 1862, he writes to newspaper editor Horace Greeley. Lincoln says, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." And yet, that very summer, in a secluded cottage on a hill overlooking Washington, Lincoln begins to pen a document that will do exactly that.
And it's in the aftermath of the Peninsula Campaign that Lincoln realizes that they need to move toward a policy that wages war not just on the Confederate Army, but on Confederate society. And the first step in that direction, he decides, is to begin emancipating the slaves.
In the wake of a string of devastating defeats on the Eastern Theater, Lincoln now sees emancipation as a military necessity. He says, "We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued." Lincoln's coming action will test the constitutional limits of the office of the presidency.
The Constitution provides that the President of the United States be the commander-in-chief in time of war or rebellion. But it doesn't describe what the powers of the commander-in-chief are. I mean, what is it to be a commander-in-chief? No one was really sure. Within those war powers, what is he allowed to do? Well, he should be allowed to do some things which will cripple the enemy's ability to carry on war. What will cripple the Confederacy's ability to carry on war? Free their slaves. Free them, give them every incentive possible to desert and run away to the Union lines. Give them every reason to expect that the advance of the Union armies into the South will mean their freedom. Subvert, undermine, weaken the Confederate ability to carry on the rebellion.
To his stunned cabinet, Lincoln unveils a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on July 22, 1862. Secretary of Treasury Salmon Chase thinks it's too extreme. Secretary of Interior Caleb Smith strongly objects and threatens to resign. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair fears it will cost the Republicans the fall elections. Lincoln pushes to release his proclamation immediately. But Secretary of State William Seward cautions the proclamation will be perceived as an act of desperation in the aftermath of the failed Peninsula Campaign. So the president agrees to hold the announcement until after a federal victory on the battlefield. The slaughter at Antietam is hardly the decisive victory Lincoln desired. On September 17, 1862, along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, more than 22,000 Union and Confederate soldiers are killed, wounded, or missing. That's nearly as many casualties as there were in 2 days of fighting at Shiloh. The Battle of Antietam ranks as the bloodiest day in American military history. Because the Confederates are forced to retreat into Virginia, the Union claims victory, but tactically, the battle is a draw. 5 days after Antietam, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issues what he calls a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The presidential order is a threat pointed directly at the Confederacy. The rebelling states have until January 1st to cease hostilities, or else, on that date, slaves in the rebelling states will be forever free.
Delivering the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was a revolutionary moment. It was a terrific blow against the Confederacy. For white Southerners, when Lincoln issued it after the Battle of Antietam, they recognized that this war for Union now was a war for Union and the destruction of slavery. The North had now raised the stakes of the game. No longer just a war for Union, but a war for Union and for Black freedom. That turned a war of conciliation into a revolutionary struggle.
The Confederates turned the proclamation into a rallying point. 800 miles from Washington, in the woodlands outside of Corinth, Mississippi, they are determined to avenge the losses at Shiloh. Following their victory at Shiloh, Union forces had advanced 22 miles south to Corinth and seized its prized railroad junction. For more than 4 months, a large garrison has occupied the strategic town. But in October 1862, the Confederates are determined to take Corinth back. 22,000 Confederate soldiers, led by Major General Earl Van Dorn, stormed through the Union defenses northwest of town, pushing the Federals back nearly 2 miles. The next day, Union artillery delivers a punishing blow to Van Dorn's men. After a savage 2-day fight, the Confederate attack is repulsed. Corinth, once and for all, is under Union control. The desperate gamble to retake Corinth costs the Confederates over 5,000 casualties, nearly twice that of the Union defenders. One Confederate division alone loses 2,500 out of 3,900 of its men. Just as devastating as the loss of human life is the permanent loss of the vital rail junction. In the fight for control of the Mississippi Valley, it is a blow from which the Confederacy will never recover. The timing of the Union victory at Corinth and Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation unleashes a movement throughout the Mississippi River Valley. 3 months before emancipation is official, thousands escape plantations and farms, taking their first precarious steps toward freedom. One Union officer complains, "They will not even wait for January 1st. I do not know what we shall do with them." For the enslaved, the Union garrison at Corinth has become a beacon of hope.
Corinth is just a short 2 or 3 days walk from the breadbasket of Mississippi. There were large plantations, and there were large farms, and there were a significant number of slaves. Same is true along the Tennessee River Basin in northern Alabama. There's a significantly large number of slaves. It's a sizable preponderance of slaves present. Therefore, they're in close proximity to what? The linchpin of Union control in northeast Mississippi, which is Corinth, once it falls and is occupied by Union forces.
In the years leading up to the war, small bands of escaping slaves sought freedom along an underground railroad leading north. But this mass movement towards Corinth and other areas in the South is unlike anything before.
Before the war, we tended to see men running on their own. We did not see whole families. We did not see couples bringing their children. This time around, they did, because they calculated in their minds that this was the moment when freedom was going to come. So this was the moment to get the entire family out of slavery, because it was actually going to happen this time.
By war's end, some 500,000 to 1 million of the South's 4 million slaves will have escaped to Union lines.
The very presence of a contraband camp, I think, speaks to the testimony of Black people's ability to create power, even in the most powerless situation.
The Union garrison in Corinth is, in fact, ill-equipped to deal with the thousands of refugees. For many soldiers, it is the first time they come face to face with the sheer magnitude of the institution of slavery.
I mean, if you grew up in Michigan, you had a good chance you had never seen an African American. Ever. If you grew up in Iowa, you had a real good chance you'd never seen an African American. Ever. In your entire life. And then you start experiencing it. And you're seeing the conditions in which they exist within this society.
For temporary shelter, the Union Army issues the contrabands old army tents. But at Corinth, the former slaves are determined to transform a refugee camp into a community. They lay out streets, build a church, hospital, and school. They plant and harvest crops. Most importantly, they plant seeds of hope.
We've escaped, so now let us do what we have always been trained to do. We will set up our own camps. We will live in these spaces. We will grow food. We will try to heal each other. We will try to live out some semblance of life as free people, or at least quasi-free people. And so they did what they had always done. They served each other. They served white people, because that's what slaves are trained to do.
Except they now, for the first time, are paid for their labor. It is just part of the transition from slave to freed men and women.
Do you know any words that start with I?
In the South, it is illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. At Corinth, volunteers from the American Missionary Association arrive to instruct the refugees.
They do this because they recognize that freedom is not going to mean much until these men, women, and children learn to read and write and are educated. And so this becomes a focus of life there in this Corinth contraband camp. And the numbers increase. By March 1863, there are about 3,600 men, women, and children there. Almost half of them are children.
In just a few months, Corinth becomes a model contraband camp in the Union-occupied South. But the success is short-lived. Inevitably, the Union force at Corinth is ordered to move on, and so are the contrabands. They are forced to leave the community they had helped to build and travel 100 miles to a refugee center in Memphis.
And that's the end of the Corinth contraband camp. It disappears. It's done. So its life is short. It has a lot of hope and a lot of promise, but it is blown away in some ways by the military, the changes in the military situation. And in some ways, that really is representative of what happens in a lot of places and tells us something about what it means to become free in the middle of a war. The military situation is constantly creating upheavals in the lives of these men, women, and children trying to become free. So the story of Corinth is in some ways the story of what happens everywhere.
The Corinth contraband camp was at once a glimpse into a life of freedom and a harbinger of the struggles ahead. Its brief success is a glimmer of hope in a year that has seen North and South spiral into an abyss of hard war. In December, at Fredericksburg, Virginia, is still another colossal blunder by a Union general. This time, Ambrose Burnside. In a series of ill-advised frontal assaults, Burnside's men are slaughtered by Robert E. Lee's Confederates, positioned along the heights above the town. One Confederate at Fredericksburg stated the charging Federals melted like snow coming down on a warm ground. The Union debacle at Fredericksburg results in 12,000 senseless casualties. 2 weeks later, in the Western Theater, is another titanic battle. This one near the Tennessee town of Murfreesboro. Along the Stones River on the final day of 1862, Union and Confederate forces square off for control of Middle Tennessee. For 2 days, the massive armies collide at places aptly named Hell's Half Acre and the Slaughter Pen. Union forces, led by General William Rosecrans, force the Confederate Army to retreat. It is a victory Lincoln desperately needs. But the cost in human lives is staggering. At the Battle of Stones River, Union and Confederate armies lose a stunning 31% of their men. The casualties exceed even those of bloody Shiloh. The shocking death tolls are another nightmare to a public now growing numb to the bloodbaths of the Civil War. Lincoln says, "If there is a worse place than hell, I am in it." In the dying light of 1862, America's fiery trial now seems to be a war without end.
The flame shall not hurt thee. I only design that draws to consume, and I go to refine.
Good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. And I want to be left behind. Good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. And I want to be left behind. There's a long white robe in the heaven I know. A long white robe in the heaven I know. There's a long white robe in the heaven I know, and I don't want to be left behind. So good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. I've got good news, chariots come, and I don't want to be left behind. There's a starry crown in the heaven I know. A starry crown in the heaven I know. There's a starry crown in the heaven I know, and I don't want to be left behind. So good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots got good news, chariots come, and I don't want to be left behind. There's some white slippers in the heaven I know. There's some white slippers in the heaven I know. And I don't want to be left behind. The good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come, and I don't want to be left behind. There's a white robe in the heaven I know. There's a white robe in the heaven I know. There's a starry crown in the heaven I know. There's a starry crown in the heaven I know. There's silver slippers in the heaven I know. Good news, Lord, chariots come. Good news, my chariots come. Good news, Lord, the chariots come. Good news, my chariots come. Good news, chariots got good news. Good news, chariots got good news. Good news, chariots come, and I don't want to be left behind. Good news, chariots come. Good news, chariots come. Good news, Good